The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow across the rows of cubicles. I sat at my desk, staring blankly at the spreadsheet on my monitor, though my mind was far from work. It had been one of those days where time seemed to stretch endlessly, each minute dragging like an anchor through molasses. My fingers hovered over the keyboard but refused to move. The clock ticked closer to 6, and the office was beginning to empty out, chairs scraping against the floor, muffled goodbyes exchanged, the soft hum of heels clicking toward the elevator. I sighed, leaning back in my chair and rubbing my temples. Work had become mechanical lately, a series of tasks I completed without passion or purpose. Life outside these walls wasn't much better. It felt like I was floating somewhere between existence and invisibility. There was no spark anymore, no thrill to chase. Just routine. Predictability. Loneliness, and then there was her. Evelyn Kane, our CEO, whose name carried weight even when whispered. She was the kind of woman who commanded attention without trying, or maybe she did try, and that was part of her allure. Everything about her screamed precision, her tailored suits, her perfectly coiffed hair, her piercing gaze that could cut through steel if she wanted it to. But beneath that icy exterior, there was something else, a flicker of vulnerability I'd glimpsed once or twice during company meetings. A hesitation before she spoke, as though weighing every word for its potential impact. Or the way her lips would curve into a faint smile that never quite reached her eyes. We didn't interact often. She existed in a different orbit entirely, high above us mere mortals who shuffled papers and answered emails all day. Still, whenever I saw her walking down the hallways, her presence demanded notice. Once, during a quarterly review meeting, she'd glanced at me briefly while delivering some impassioned speech about innovation and growth. Her eyes locked onto mine for just a second too long, and I swear my heart skipped a beat. Maybe it was nothing. Probably it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she saw me, not just as another employee, but as someone worth looking at. That's why, when my phone buzzed with an email notification, my stomach dropped. The subject line read, "Please see me in my office at 6 p.m. No explanation, no pleasantries. Just those 9 words signed off with her initials, EK. My pulse quickened as I stared at the screen. This wasn't unusual behavior for Evelyn, she rarely wasted time on niceties. But still, why me? And why now? For the next hour, paranoia gnawed at me. Had I made a mistake in last week's report? Was this about the client pitch I'd barely managed to salvage? Or worse, was this personal? My imagination spiraled wildly, conjuring scenarios ranging from professional reprimands to something more sinister. By the time 5:50 rolled around, I was practically nauseous when I finally stood outside her office door, clutching the folder I'd brought just in case. I hesitated. Through the frosted glass panel etched with her name, I could see her silhouette moving behind her desk. She was pacing, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Taking a deep breath, I knocked lightly. "Come in," came her voice, crisp, authoritative, and laced with an edge that sent shivers down my spine. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside. Her office was everything you'd expect from someone like Evelyn, sleek, minimalist, almost intimidating in its perfection. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline, bathed in the golden hues of twilight. A leather couch sat against one wall, flanked by shelves filled with books and awards. And there she was, standing near her desk, arms crossed loosely over her chest. She turned to face me, and for a moment, we simply looked at each other. "You're punctual," she said after what felt like an eternity. "I appreciate that." Her tone was neutral, giving nothing away. Yet her eyes, they lingered on me longer than necessary, studying me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. Whatever this meeting was about, it wasn't going to be ordinary. She gestured for me to sit. I realized 2 things simultaneously. First, that my palms were clammy, and second, that I hadn't exhaled since walking in. Evelyn took her seat across from me, folding her hands neatly on the desk. For a brief moment, silence stretched between us, heavy and electric. Then she leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. "I called you here because I need your help with something important," she began, her voice softer now, almost hesitant. Something personal. The air shifted. Suddenly, the mundane worries I'd carried into this room, the fear of being fired, of messing up yet another task, felt laughably trivial compared to the gravity of her words. Personal? What could possibly be personal enough for Evelyn Kane to call me, of all people, into her office? Before I could process further, she added, "But before we discuss that, tell me, Clara, how have you been?" It was the first time she'd ever used my name. Her question hung in the air, simple yet loaded with implications I couldn't fully grasp. How have you been? It wasn't just small talk. Evelyn didn't do small talk. Her gaze was steady, searching, as though she were trying to peel back layers of my carefully constructed facade. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, unsure how to respond. "I've been fine," I said finally, the words feeling hollow even as they left my lips. Fine was such a bland word, so inadequate for the storm brewing inside me. But what else could I say? That I'd spent most of my nights staring at the ceiling, replaying every awkward interaction and missed opportunity? That I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her brow furrowing in a way that suggested she saw right through my answer. "Fine," she repeated softly, almost to herself. Then, after a pause, "You don't strike me as someone who settles for fine." The comment caught me off guard. Was this some kind of test? Or was she genuinely interested in how I was doing? Either way, it unsettled me. There was something disarmingly human about her in that moment, something raw and unguarded, that made her seem less like the untouchable CEO and more like, well, a person. A person who might actually care. She leaned back in her chair, breaking eye contact briefly, to glance out the window. The city lights twinkled beyond the glass, reflecting faintly in her dark eyes when she turned back to me. "Let's cut to the chase," she said, her tone shifting ever so slightly. "I need your discretion, and your help, with something sensitive." My stomach tightened again. Sensitive? What did that even mean? Before I could ask, she stood abruptly and walked over to the couch, motioning for me to join her. Hesitant but curious, I followed, perching on the edge of the cushion while she settled into the corner opposite me. Up close, I noticed things I hadn't before, the faint lines around her eyes that hinted at sleepless nights, the subtle scent of citrus and sandalwood clinging to her skin, the way her fingers drummed lightly against her knee, a nervous habit I hadn't expected from someone so composed. "I trust you," she began, her voice low and measured. "More than I should, perhaps. But there's no one else I can turn to." Her admission startled me. Trust? From her? The woman who ruled our company with an iron fist, whose very presence intimidated everyone within a 10-foot radius? And yet, here she was, looking at me like I mattered. Like I was capable of handling whatever burden she was about to place on my shoulders. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Instead, she studied me intently, as if weighing whether to take the leap. Finally, she exhaled sharply and reached into her blazer pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to me without explanation, her hand brushing mine briefly in the exchange. The touch sent a jolt through me, unexpected and electric. Unfolding the paper, I found myself staring at a photograph. At first glance, it seemed ordinary enough, a candid shot of Evelyn standing outside a cafe, laughing at something unseen. But then I noticed the figure beside her, a woman with fiery red hair and a radiant smile, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that spoke volumes. My heart sank as realization dawned. "Who is she?" I asked quietly, though I already suspected the answer. "My sister," Evelyn replied, her voice tinged with both fondness and pain. "Or rather, my half-sister. We haven't spoken in years." The story poured out of her then, halting and fragmented but deeply personal. Her father had remarried late in life, and this woman, Lila, was the product of that union. Their relationship had always been strained, complicated by family politics and unresolved resentment. But recently, Lila had reached out, claiming she needed Evelyn's help with something urgent. "Something dangerous. She says she's in trouble," Evelyn continued, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. But she won't tell me what it is unless I meet her in person. Alone. And you want me to come with you? I ventured, piecing it together. She nodded. Not just as backup. As a buffer. Someone impartial who can help me decide whether to trust her or walk away. It was insane. Completely irrational. And yet, I found myself nodding before I could stop myself. How could I refuse? This wasn't just about protecting the company or preserving my job, it was about helping her. About being the person she trusted when no one else would. The next evening, we met at a quiet diner tucked away in a part of town I rarely visited. Evelyn had insisted on keeping things low-key, wary of drawing attention. When I arrived, she was already seated in a booth near the back, scrolling absently through her phone. She looked different tonight, less polished, more approachable in a simple blouse and jeans. For a moment, I forgot why we were here, distracted by the sight of her looking so normal. You came, she said as I slid into the booth across from her. There was a flicker of relief in her expression, quickly masked by her usual composure. Of course I did, I replied, forcing a smile. So, what's the plan? She hesitated, glancing toward the entrance. Lila will be here soon. Just stay close, okay? I don't know what to expect. We didn't have to wait long. A few minutes later, the bell above the door jingled, and in walked a whirlwind of energy and color. Lila was even more striking in person, her red hair cascading down her back like fire. She spotted us immediately and strode over, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. Up close, the resemblance between the sisters was undeniable, the same sharp cheekbones, the same piercing gaze, but where Evelyn radiated control, Lila seemed wild and untamed. Evelyn, she greeted coolly, sliding into the booth beside her. Her eyes flicked to me briefly, before returning to her sister. And who's this? This is Clara, Evelyn said evenly. A colleague. And a friend. The emphasis on the last word wasn't lost on me, or on Lila, judging by the raised eyebrow she gave Evelyn. But she didn't press further, instead launching into a convoluted tale about financial troubles and shady acquaintances. The details blurred together as I watched Evelyn's face grow increasingly tense. Whatever bond they once shared was buried under layers of mistrust and bitterness, and it was clear neither of them knew how to bridge the gap. By the time dessert arrived, the tension was palpable. Lila excused herself to use the restroom, leaving Evelyn and me alone. She slumped back against the booth, rubbing her temples in frustration. This was a mistake, she muttered under her breath. I shouldn't have come. You're stronger than you think, I told her gently, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice. Whatever happens, you'll figure it out. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time I saw gratitude in her eyes. Not just for my words, but for being there. For listening. For caring. When Lila returned, the conversation shifted again, veering into territory neither Evelyn nor I anticipated. By the end of the night, secrets had been laid bare, alliances tested, and emotions laid raw. And somewhere amidst the chaos, I realized something startling. I wasn't just drawn to Evelyn because of her power or mystery. I was drawn to her because she let me see the cracks in her armor, and because, somehow, I wanted to help her heal. As we stepped out into the cool night air, Evelyn paused and turned to me. Thank you, she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. For everything. I nodded, unable to find the words to match the weight of the moment. But as we walked to the car in silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The drive back from the diner was quiet, save for the soft hum of the car's engine and the occasional rustle of fabric as Evelyn shifted in her seat. She hadn't said much since we left, her hands gripping the steering wheel with a tension that mirrored the storm brewing inside her. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the silence, but the words felt stuck somewhere between my heart and my throat. Instead, I stared out the window, watching the city blur past in streaks of neon and shadow. When we finally pulled into the parking garage beneath her building, she killed the engine and sat there for a moment, her chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. The air between us crackled with unspoken thoughts, heavy with everything we'd witnessed, and everything we hadn't yet dared to acknowledge. "Do you want to come up?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely audible over the faint echo of footsteps from somewhere in the distance. I turned to look at her, startled by the question. "Up where?" "My apartment," she clarified, glancing at me briefly, before looking away. "It's late. You shouldn't be driving home alone." Her tone was casual, almost dismissive, but there was an undercurrent of something else. Hesitation? Vulnerability? Whatever it was, it made my pulse quicken. Saying yes felt reckless, dangerous even. But saying no, that felt impossible. "Okay," I heard myself reply, the words slipping out before I could second-guess it. Evelyn's apartment was nothing like I'd imagined. While her office exuded cold precision, her home was warm and inviting, filled with rich textures and soft lighting. A plush cream-colored rug covered the living room floor, and shelves lined with books and framed photographs gave the space a lived-in charm. The scent of vanilla candles lingered in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of coffee still clinging to the kitchen counter. "Make yourself comfortable," she said, shrugging off her blazer and tossing it onto the arm of the couch. She moved with an ease I'd never seen in her before, as though shedding not just her clothes, but also the weight of the persona she carried at work. It was disarming and intoxicating. I sank into the couch, running my fingers absently over the smooth leather. Evelyn disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with 2 glasses of red wine. She handed one to me, our fingers brushing again in the exchange. This time, neither of us pulled away immediately. "To surviving family drama," she said wryly, raising her glass in a mock toast. Her lips curved into a small, self-deprecating smile that softened the sharp angles of her face. "To surviving," I echoed, clinking my glass against hers. The wine was velvety and rich, its warmth spreading through me as I took a sip. For a moment, we simply sat there, savoring the quiet comfort of shared understanding. "So," Evelyn began after a while, setting her glass down on the coffee table. "What do you think of Lila?" The question caught me off guard. "Honestly? I don't know what to think. She's intense." Evelyn chuckled softly, the sound low and musical. "That's one way to put it." "She loves you," I added cautiously, choosing my words carefully. "Even if she doesn't know how to show it." Evelyn's expression darkened, her gaze drifting toward the window. "Love isn't enough sometimes. Not when trust is broken." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I wanted to ask more, about their father, about the years of silence, but something told me now wasn't the right time. Instead, I reached out instinctively, placing my hand lightly on hers. The contact was fleeting, but it sent a ripple of electricity through me, leaving my skin tingling long after I pulled away. "I'm sorry," I murmured. "For everything you're dealing with." She looked at me then, her eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch. "Why are you so kind to me, Clara? You barely know me." I faltered, unsure how to articulate the jumble of emotions swirling inside me. "Because I see you. All of you. Not just the CEO everyone's afraid of, but the person underneath. And I think, you deserve someone who sees that." Her lips parted slightly, as though she wanted to respond but couldn't find the words. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, the space between us charged with unspoken longing. Then, abruptly, she stood and walked over to the window, wrapping her arms around herself as though warding off a chill. "You should go," she said quietly, her back to me. "It's late." The dismissal stung, though I tried to hide it. Standing, I gathered my things and headed toward the door. Just as I reached for the handle, her voice stopped me. "Clara." I turned to find her standing a few feet away, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "For tonight. For everything." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Anytime." The days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions. On the surface, life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be when your boss had invited you into her personal life and then pushed you away just as quickly. At work, Evelyn reverted to her usual aloof demeanor, treating me with the same professional detachment she extended to everyone else. But every now and then, I'd catch her watching me, her gaze lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. Those moments left me breathless, my mind racing with questions I didn't dare ask. One afternoon, I found myself lingering in the break room, nursing a cup of coffee and staring blankly at the wall. I was lost in thought when a familiar voice startled me. "You've been avoiding me." I turned to see Evelyn standing in the doorway, her arms crossed loosely over her chest. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a challenge in her tone that made my stomach flip. I protested weakly, though we both knew it was a lie. She stepped closer, closing the distance between us until she was close enough to touch. "Don't lie to me, Clara. You've been avoiding eye contact, ducking out of meetings early." "Did I do something wrong?" "No," I said quickly, shaking my head. "It's not you. It's me. I just don't know where I stand with you anymore." Her brow furrowed, confusion flickering across her features. "Where you stand?" "Yes." My voice cracked slightly, betraying the vulnerability I'd been trying so hard to hide. "You let me in, Evelyn. You trusted me with something deeply personal, and then you shut me out again. I don't know what you want from me." For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then, slowly, she reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder. The touch was gentle, tentative, as though she was afraid I might pull away. When I didn't, she slid her hand down my arm until our fingers intertwined. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of letting you in too far. Of needing you too much. Of ruining whatever this is between us." Her confession hit me like a tidal wave, knocking the air from my lungs. Here was Evelyn Kane, the woman who commanded boardrooms and brokered million-dollar deals, admitting she was afraid. Afraid of me. It was humbling and terrifying all at once. "I'm scared too," I confessed, my own voice trembling. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe we can figure it out together." Her grip on my hand tightened, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen before: hope. Fragile, tentative, but unmistakable. Over the next few weeks, our connection deepened in ways I hadn't thought possible. We started meeting for coffee during lunch breaks, sharing stories about our childhoods and dreams we'd long since abandoned. She introduced me to her favorite jazz playlist, and I showed her how to bake chocolate chip cookies without burning them. Each moment brought us closer, yet the unresolved tension between us remained, a tantalizing promise neither of us was ready to act on. One evening, as we sat side by side on her couch watching an old black and white film, she leaned her head against my shoulder. The gesture was simple, innocent, but it sent a rush of warmth through me. I rested my cheek against the top of her head, breathing in the subtle floral notes of her shampoo. In that moment, everything felt perfect, and impossibly complicated. "What happens next?" I whispered, more to myself than to her. She didn't answer, but her hand found mine in the darkness, her fingers threading through mine with a certainty that spoke louder than words. Rain lashed against the windows of Evelyn's penthouse, the storm outside mirroring the turbulence brewing within me. We had been sitting in silence for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the floor. She sat on the opposite end of the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, staring into the empty fireplace as if searching for answers in the unlit logs. It had started innocently enough, a late-night work call that turned into an impromptu strategy session over wine. But somewhere between discussing quarterly projections and reminiscing about childhood memories, the air had shifted. Subtle at first, a lingering glance here, a hesitant touch there. Now, the tension between us was palpable, crackling like static electricity, daring either of us to make the first move. "I shouldn't have asked you to stay," Evelyn said finally, her voice barely audible over the patter of raindrops. Her eyes remained fixed on the fireplace, but I could see the flicker of uncertainty in her expression. "Why not?" I asked softly, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. "Because of what might happen? Or because of what already has?" She flinched at my words, her shoulders tensing as though bracing for impact. When she finally looked at me, her gaze was raw, stripped of its usual armor. "Because I don't know how to stop this," she admitted, her voice trembling. "And I'm terrified of what happens if I can't." Her honesty took my breath away. For all her poise and control, Evelyn Kane was just as lost as I was, maybe even more so. In that moment, she wasn't the unshakable CEO or the guarded woman who kept everyone at arm's length. She was simply human, vulnerable in a way that made my chest ache with both longing and fear. "You don't have to stop anything," I whispered, leaning closer until our knees almost touched. My pulse raced, each beat urging me forward, despite the voice in my head screaming caution. "Not unless you want to." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Instead, she reached for her glass of wine, taking a slow sip as though trying to steady herself. When she set it down again, her hands were shaking slightly. "This isn't just about me, Clara," she said, her tone heavy with regret. If I cross this line, it changes everything. For both of us." "I know," I replied, my voice breaking slightly. "But maybe change isn't such a bad thing." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the wind rattling the windows as lightning illuminated the skyline beyond. Then, without warning, Evelyn stood abruptly, pacing toward the window. Her silhouette was framed by the city lights, her figure sharp and angular against the chaos of the night. "This is reckless," she muttered, more to herself than to me. "Completely reckless." "And yet here we are," I countered, standing to join her. My steps were deliberate, measured, until I was close enough to feel the heat radiating from her body. Close enough to smell the faint trace of vanilla still clinging to her skin. "Evelyn," she turned to face me then, her eyes wild with conflicting emotions, fear, desire, desperation. Before I could second-guess myself, I reached up and cupped her cheek, my thumb brushing gently over her jawline. Her breath hitched, and for a fleeting moment, I thought she might pull away. But instead, she leaned into my touch, her eyelids fluttering shut as though savoring the contact. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Not as a colleague. Not as a friend. Not as whatever this is becoming." "You won't," I promised, my own voice, barely above a whisper. "But you have to trust me. Trust us." Her hands found mine then, intertwining our fingers as though afraid to let go. For a heartbeat, we simply stood there, suspended in the fragile space between hesitation and surrender. And then, slowly, she closed the distance between us. The first brush of her lips against mine was tentative, almost shy, a question rather than a declaration. But when I responded, tilting my head to deepen the kiss, something inside her seemed to break free. Her arms wrapped around me, pulling me flush against her as though she never intended to let go. The kiss grew urgent, passionate, filled with all the longing and vulnerability we'd been holding back for weeks. It wasn't perfect, our teeth clashed once, and her grip on my waist was almost painfully tight, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the way she melted into me, her defenses crumbling under the weight of everything unsaid. What mattered was the way my name slipped from her lips like a prayer when we finally broke apart, gasping for air. We stared at each other, chests heaving, foreheads pressed together as reality began to seep back in. The enormity of what we'd just done hit me like a freight train, leaving me dizzy and disoriented. This wasn't just a kiss, it was a promise. A commitment. A leap into the unknown. "What now?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely audible over the storm raging outside, and the one threatening to consume us both. I didn't have an answer. All I could do was tighten my hold on her, as though willing the world to pause long enough for us to catch our breath. But even as we clung to each other, the questions lingered, unanswered and unresolved. What would happen tomorrow? Next week? Next year? Could we navigate the fallout of this moment without losing ourselves, or each other, in the process? As the rain continued to pour and the city lights flickered beyond the glass, one thing became clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The morning after the storm came too quickly, dragging me out of a restless sleep and into the harsh light of reality. I woke up tangled in Evelyn's sheets, the faint scent of her perfume still lingering on the pillow beside me. For a moment, I allowed myself to bask in the memory of the night before, the way she had held me, kissed me, whispered my name like it was the only word that mattered. But as the haze of sleep faded, the weight of what we'd done settled over me like a suffocating blanket. Evelyn wasn't there when I opened my eyes. The bed was cold on her side, the indentation of her body already fading. Panic bubbled in my chest as I sat up, clutching the sheet around me like a shield. Had she regretted it? Was this all some terrible mistake? I found her in the kitchen, dressed in one of her signature tailored blazers, and sipping coffee at the counter. She looked every bit the composed CEO I'd always known, except for the dark circles under her eyes, and the way her hands trembled slightly as she set the mug down. "Good morning," she said without turning to face me. Her tone was neutral, but there was an edge to it that made my stomach churn. "Morning," I replied cautiously, wrapping the sheet tighter around myself as though it could protect me from whatever was coming next. "You okay?" She hesitated, then turned to look at me. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of professionalism that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We need to talk." Those 4 words sent a jolt of dread through me. They were the prelude to every breakup, every confrontation, every moment of heartbreak I'd ever experienced. Still, I nodded and forced myself to meet her gaze. "Okay. Talk." Evelyn sighed, running a hand through her perfectly styled hair, a rare sign of frustration. "Last night wasn't planned. It shouldn't have happened." My heart sank, though I tried to hide it. But it did happen. And now we have to figure out what it means. "That's just it," she said sharply, her composure slipping for a brief moment. "I don't know what it means. I don't know how to balance this, us, with everything else. My career. Your position at the company. The scrutiny we'll face if anyone finds out." Her words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. We lived in a world where appearances mattered more than substance, where relationships like ours were met with judgment and disdain. Even within the relative safety of our own lives, the risks were immense. If word got out, it could destroy both of our careers, and possibly something far more precious. "I'm not asking you to have all the answers right now," I said softly, stepping closer despite the tension crackling between us. "But I am asking you to trust me. To trust us." Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might push me away again. Instead, she reached out and took my hand, her grip firm yet hesitant. "I want to trust you, Clara. More than anything. But I can't ignore the consequences. Not just for us, but for everyone involved." By the time I returned to work later that day, the guilt was already eating away at me. I avoided eye contact with my coworkers, terrified they might somehow see the truth written all over my face. Every casual conversation felt like an interrogation, every glance in my direction a potential accusation. Even the familiar hum of the office seemed louder, more oppressive, as though the walls themselves were closing, and Evelyn acted as though nothing had changed. She breezed through meetings with her usual efficiency, her demeanor cool and collected. To anyone else, she was the same untouchable CEO who ruled the company with an iron fist. But I saw the cracks beneath the surface, the slight tremor in her voice during presentations, the way her eyes darted toward me whenever she thought no one was looking. She was struggling just as much as I was, even if she refused to show it. The first real test came 2 days later, during a team lunch at a nearby cafe. Evelyn rarely attended these gatherings, preferring to keep her distance from the social dynamics of the office. But today, she joined us unexpectedly, sliding into the booth across from me with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "So, Clara," one of my colleagues piped up, oblivious to the tension simmering between Evelyn and me. "Any plans for the weekend? Seeing anyone special?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut, and I froze, unsure how to respond. Before I could stammer out an answer, Evelyn interjected smoothly. "Clara's been focused on work lately. No time for distractions." Her tone was light, almost teasing, but the underlying message was clear: don't say anything. I forced a laugh, nodding in agreement, but inside, I felt sick. How long could we keep pretending? How long before someone noticed the way her gaze lingered on me just a fraction too long, or the way my breath hitched whenever she entered the room? After lunch, Evelyn pulled me aside under the guise of discussing a project deadline. We stood in the shadow of the building, hidden from prying eyes, though neither of us spoke for a long moment. Finally, she broke the silence. "You handled that well," she said quietly, her eyes scanning my face for any sign of distress. "I shouldn't have to handle it at all," I shot back, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "This isn't fair, Evelyn. We're tiptoeing around each other like we're doing something wrong. Like we should be ashamed." "We are doing something wrong," she snapped, her composure cracking, for the first time since the incident. "Do you think I don't feel it too? The guilt? The fear? But we don't have a choice, Clara. Not if we want to protect ourselves, and each other." Her words cut deep, not because they were untrue, but because they highlighted the impossible position we were in. She was right, we couldn't afford to be reckless. But that didn't make it hurt any less. Things only grew more complicated over the following weeks. Rumors began circulating around the office, whispers about Evelyn's behavior, speculations about why she suddenly seemed so invested in mentoring me. At first, I dismissed them as harmless gossip, the kind of idle chatter that thrived in corporate environments. But when Lila showed up unannounced at Evelyn's apartment one evening, the stakes became painfully cleared. I had stayed late to help Evelyn finalize a presentation, and we were sitting on the couch when the doorbell rang. Evelyn stiffened, her eyes narrowing as she rose to answer it. When she opened the door, Lila stood there, her fiery hair damp from the rain and her expression stormy. "Can we talk?" Lila demanded, brushing past Evelyn without waiting for an invitation. Her gaze landed on me, and her lips curled into a knowing smirk. "Oh, am I interrupting something?" "No," Evelyn said firmly, closing the door behind her sister. "What do you want, Lila?" Lila ignored the question, striding further into the apartment until she was standing directly in front of me. "So this is her," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "The mysterious colleague you've been spending so much time with." "It's none of your business," Evelyn snapped, moving to stand between us. "Whatever issues you have with me, leave Clara out of it." "Oh, I plan to," Lila replied sweetly, though her eyes gleamed with malice. "For now. But if anyone else starts asking questions," she let the threat hang in the air, unspoken yet unmistakable. My blood ran cold as I realized the danger we were in, not just from Lila, but from anyone who might piece together the truth. Evelyn's reputation, her career, everything she had worked for, it could all come crashing down because of us. When Lila finally left, slamming the door behind her, Evelyn sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she muttered, her voice muffled by despair. "If she tells anyone, she won't," I said quickly, kneeling beside her and placing a hand on her knee. "We'll figure this out. Together." But even as I said the words, doubt gnawed at me. Could we really survive this? Or were we destined to crumble under the weight of our secrets? The days that followed Lila's visit felt like walking a tightrope. Every interaction, every glance, carried the weight of unspoken fears and simmering tensions. Evelyn became more distant at work, retreating behind her usual armor of professionalism as though trying to convince herself, and everyone else, that nothing had changed. But I could see the cracks forming, the toll it was taking on her. Late nights in her office turned into sleepless ones, and the sharpness of her wit dulled under the strain of carrying secrets too heavy for one person alone. For my part, I tried to keep up appearances, but it was exhausting. The guilt gnawed at me constantly, not because I regretted what had happened between us, but because I hated seeing her suffer. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Love, or whatever it was we shared, shouldn't feel like a burden. Yet here we were, trapped in a web of our own making, unable to move forward without risking everything. One evening, after another grueling day at the office, Evelyn called me into her office just as the last stragglers were leaving. Her expression was unreadable, her voice clipped when she spoke. "We need to settle this. Once and for all." My stomach tightened. Settle it? What did that even mean? Was she ready to end things before they'd truly begun? Or was she finally willing to face the truth head-on? She gestured for me to sit, then leaned back in her chair, studying me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I've been thinking about what you said, she began slowly, choosing her words carefully. About trust. About us. And I realized something, I can't keep living like this. Pretending. Hiding. It's killing me. Her admission caught me off guard. For weeks, she had resisted any notion of vulnerability, clinging to control as though it were the only thing keeping her afloat. But now, sitting across from me, she looked fragile, human, in a way I hadn't seen since the night we first kissed. What are you saying? I asked cautiously, afraid to hope I'm saying. She paused, exhaling sharply as though steeling herself for what came next. I'm saying I don't want to lose you. Not again. Not ever. But if we're going to do this, if we're going to be something, we have to stop running from it. From us. Her words sent a rush of warmth through me, but also a flicker of fear. And what about everything else? The risks? The fallout? I won't lie to you, she said, her voice steady, despite the storm raging in her eyes. It won't be easy. There will be consequences. People will talk. Maybe even try to tear us apart. But I'd rather face all of that than spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been. Tears welled in my eyes, blurring her features as I struggled to process what she was offering, not just a relationship, but a partnership. A commitment to fight for each other, no matter the cost. But how? I whispered, my voice breaking slightly. How do we make this work? One step at a time, she replied, reaching across the desk to take my hand. Her touch was warm, grounding, a reminder that we weren't alone in this. We start by being honest, with ourselves, with each other. Then we figure out the rest together. That weekend, we took the first step. Evelyn invited me to a quiet cabin she owned outside the city, a place she rarely spoke about but clearly cherished. Nestled deep in the woods, it was a sanctuary away from prying eyes and judgmental whispers. The air smelled of pine and earth, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and distant chirping of birds. As we sat by the fireplace that night, wrapped in blankets and sipping hot cocoa, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. For the first time, there was no pretense, no walls between us. Just two people learning to navigate the messy, beautiful terrain of love. I used to think I had everything figured out, Evelyn mused, staring into the flames. My career, my life, everything neatly planned. And then you came along and turned it all upside down. Is that a bad thing? I teased, nudging her gently. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up her entire face. No. It's terrifying. But it's also freeing. Like maybe I don't have to be perfect all the time. Maybe I can just be. Her words resonated deeply, echoing the lessons I'd learned along the way. Love wasn't about perfection or control, it was about embracing imperfection, about finding beauty in the chaos. Together, we were stronger, not because we had all the answers, but because we were willing to ask the hard questions. When we returned to the city, things didn't magically fall into place. Rumors still swirled, and Lila remained a looming threat. But we faced them together, side by side, refusing to let fear dictate our choices. Slowly, painfully, we carved out a space for ourselves, a fragile yet resilient bond built on trust, honesty, and the courage to defy expectations. In the end, it wasn't about having everything figured out. It was about choosing each other, again and again, even when the path ahead was uncertain. Even when the world seemed determined to pull us apart. As we stood on the rooftop of her building one crisp autumn evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Evelyn slipped her hand into mine. Whatever happens next, she said softly, her breath visible in the cool air, we'll face it together. I squeezed her hand, leaning my head against her shoulder. Together. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it.